They thought they had seen everything inside Graceland. The jumpsuits, the gold records, the Cadillac collection gleaming under museum lights. But beneath the polished floors and velvet ropes was a place no tour guide ever mentioned. Locked, hidden, and untouched for decades, it was Elvis Presley's basement. What was inside would leave even the most loyal fans speechless. Dusty boxes stacked against crumbling brick walls, a safe sealed tight since the king's final days. Handwritten notes that revealed the kind of man Elvis never wanted the public to see. For years, the Presley family kept it closed, protecting his image and guarding his secrets. But once the door was finally opened, what they found shook even them to the core. Because what lived in that basement wasn't just memorabilia. It was Elvis's shadow, the truth of a life spent in the spotlight, but haunted by demons in the dark. And once the contents came out, there was no going back. Graceland has always been more than a mansion. To Elvis's fans, it became a holy site, a place where millions walked through the gates each year to catch a glimpse of the life their idol once lived. They saw the jungle room, the music room, the mirrored staircases, the velvet walls, the trophies, and the glory. But what most never realized was that the heart of Graceland wasn't in the rooms bathed in light. It was hidden beneath, down a narrow staircase few dared to enter. The basement was never part of the official tour. Guides would mention it in passing but carefully change the subject, insisting that part of the home was closed off for family reasons. Even longtime staff whispered about what might be down there, though most admitted they had never been allowed inside. For decades, rumors swirled. Some claimed Elvis had used it as a private recording den, cutting rough takes of songs he didn't want anyone to hear. Others swore it was his hiding place when the pressures of fame grew too great, a space where he could be alone with his thoughts, away from cameras and obligations. Collectors and insiders speculated endlessly. If Elvis kept anything deeply personal, it wouldn't be in the trophy cases upstairs. It would be in that basement. And yet the truth was stranger and far more haunting than anyone imagined. Because when the doors were finally opened, what lay inside wasn't just a collection of mementos, it was evidence of a man struggling to hold his world together. The king of rock and roll, who seemed untouchable to the outside world, had left behind a time capsule of vulnerability, fear, and longing. The basement wasn't a place of glamour, it was a vault of shadows. And once those shadows were brought into the light, they revealed a story Elvis never wanted told. The first boxes they pulled from Elvis's basement were not filled with glittering stage costumes or priceless gold records. They were ordinary cardboard, taped shut, their labels faded by time. But when opened, they revealed fragments of a hidden life. Inside were reels of old tape, their labels scrawled in Elvis's unmistakable handwriting. Midnight thoughts. For me only. Never play. They weren't polished studio takes or rehearsal tracks. They were recordings of Elvis alone with his guitar, his voice stripped bare, trembling with emotion. On some tapes, he sang songs the world never heard, raw ballads about loss, regret, and weariness. On others, he spoke more than he sang, using the microphone like a confessional, as though he knew no one else could understand the weight of carrying the crown of rock and roll. Alongside the tapes were notebooks filled with scribbled lyrics, half-finished lines that bled with pain. One page read, "Fame is the loneliest prison, and I am its warden and prisoner all the same." Another contained only 3 words written over and over, "I want peace." Then came the photographs, personal snapshots never meant for public eyes. Elvis sitting alone at the piano, head bowed, cigarette burning down in his hand. Elvis walking through Graceland's halls at night, his face gaunt, his eyes heavy with sadness. These weren't the images of the king larger than life, but of a man shrinking beneath the crown. For years, fans saw him as invincible, a legend who could command any stage. But in these dusty boxes, he revealed himself as fragile, aching, desperate for someone to see the real person behind the legend. The basement, in those first discoveries, wasn't just a storage room. It was a mirror reflecting the cracks in Elvis's soul. And the deeper they dug, the more it became clear. He hadn't just left behind treasures, he had left behind the truth he never dared to share with the world. As more crates and trunks were carried up from the basement, the picture of Elvis's hidden world grew stranger. At first, there were items you might expect: stage outfits that never made it to the spotlight, custom-made jumpsuits with rhinestones missing, sketches of designs he seemed to have abandoned. But then came objects that left even seasoned collectors unsettled. One trunk contained dozens of prescription bottles, some still half-filled, each with Elvis's name carefully typed across the labels. Many were familiar, the same kinds of medications that fueled rumors about his final days. But some were unmarked, with only handwritten notes on masking tape, cryptic words like, "For the nights I can't sleep," or "Take when the walls close in." Alongside them were stacks of spiritual books, worn from use, from nearly every faith imaginable. The Bible sat next to texts on Buddhism, mysticism, astrology, even obscure works about life after death. It was as though Elvis had been searching for answers everywhere, desperate to find some kind of truth to quiet the storms inside him. In another box, old firearms rested beside strange personal trinkets, knives, badges, and police memorabilia he had quietly collected. There were reports that Elvis had been obsessed with law enforcement, handing out honorary badges, surrounding himself with symbols of authority, as if they gave him strength. But seeing them together, hidden away underground, felt different. It looked less like a hobby and more like an obsession. And then there were the costumes, not the glittering capes of his Las Vegas years, but bizarre outfits, robes, masks, uniforms he never wore in public. Why he kept them remained a mystery, but in the dim light of the basement, they seemed unsettling, almost theatrical, like disguises for a man trying to escape himself. Every artifact added another layer to the portrait. Elvis Presley wasn't just the king, he was a man grasping for control, for identity, for meaning, even as the world saw him as untouchable. And as strange as these objects were, they were nothing compared to what was found next. Among the most unsettling discoveries in the basement were a collection of reel-to-reel tapes tucked away in an old chest marked simply "Private." Unlike the musical recordings, these were not songs or rehearsals. They were spoken words, midnight confessions whispered into the void. The first tape began with silence, then the faint sound of Elvis shifting in his chair, clearing his throat, and finally speaking in a low, weary voice. "I don't know who I am anymore," he muttered, followed by a long pause. For the next hour, he poured out thoughts he never shared with his closest friends, let alone the millions who adored him. He talked about betrayal, about people he once trusted who turned on him, about the crushing weight of being Elvis Presley, when all he wanted was to be a man named Elvis Aaron. On one tape, his voice cracked as he spoke of Priscilla, of the love he lost and the regret he carried. On another, he spoke of Lisa Marie, his daughter, calling her his only true light, his only reason for fighting to keep going. But the most chilling recordings were the ones where he spoke of fame itself. He described it not as a blessing, but as a curse, a gilded cage that trapped him inside a role he could never escape. "They cheer for the king," he said bitterly, "but nobody sees the man who has to go home alone." At times, he drifted into paranoia, convinced that people were watching him, using him, waiting for him to fall. At other times, his words were drenched in sorrow, a man pleading with the darkness for peace he could never find in life. The confession tapes weren't meant for release. They weren't meant for anyone. They were Elvis's most private thoughts, sealed away in the one place he thought the world would never look, his basement. And hearing them now, decades later, was like stepping into his mind in his final years, a haunting reminder that even kings can crumble when the crown grows too heavy. As the basement was slowly emptied, there remained one object that overshadowed all the boxes, trunks, and dusty shelves: a large steel safe wedged against the far wall. Rust streaked its edges, its lock sealed shut, untouched for decades. For years, rumors swirled about Elvis owning safes filled with cash, jewels, or even government documents he had been gifted by powerful friends, but no one expected what was truly inside. After careful work, the lock was forced open, and the heavy door creaked forward, releasing a stale gust of air that seemed frozen in time. Inside were neatly stacked envelopes, each labeled in Elvis's unmistakable hand. They weren't contracts or financial ledgers. They were letters, dozens of them. Some written to friends and colleagues, others to names only a handful of people recognized, but most were to two women, Priscilla and Lisa Marie. The letters to Priscilla revealed a man who still carried immense love and sorrow for his lost marriage. In one, he wrote, "I wish I could have been stronger for you. I wore the crown, but I couldn't wear the man you needed." Another letter, never sent, pleaded for forgiveness, confessing that the life of Elvis Presley consumed him so fully that it left little room for the man she had fallen in love with. These weren't the words of a superstar. They were the words of a broken husband. Then there were the letters to Lisa Marie. Heartfelt, emotional, sometimes rambling, they painted a portrait of a father desperate to protect his little girl from the weight of his fame. In one letter, written only months before his death, he confessed, "I don't want you to grow up in my shadow. I want you to be free. I want you to live without chains, the ones I put on myself." Reading them now, it is impossible not to hear the pain of a father who knew he might not be there to watch his daughter grow up. But perhaps the most shocking discovery inside the safe was not a letter, but a single, worn journal. Inside, Elvis had scribbled down thoughts about his career, his health, and his deep distrust of those around him. He wrote of feeling controlled, manipulated by handlers and business partners who cared more about money than the man himself. He wrote of dreams of escaping, of leaving it all behind, of disappearing from the public eye entirely. One chilling line stood out: "If I vanish, they'll never let me rest. If I stay, they'll work me to death. Either way, I lose." The safe didn't hold treasures of wealth. It held treasures of truth. And in those pages and letters, Elvis revealed more of himself than any performance ever could. The king of rock and roll had been trapped between his legend and his humanity, and in his basement safe, he left behind the evidence of just how heavy that burden had become. The deeper they searched the basement, the more the discoveries shifted from tragic to disturbing, painting a picture of Elvis Presley that few could have ever imagined. Among the artifacts were stacks of newspaper clippings. But these weren't about his own triumphs or concerts. They were about death. Elvis had kept detailed archives of obituaries and reports about other musicians who had died young, from Buddy Holly to Janis Joplin, as if he was cataloging the fates of his peers, warning himself of the road he too was traveling. Some pages were underlined, with chilling notes scribbled in the margins: "Too soon," "Why not me?" and This is how legends end. Alongside these clippings were manila folders stuffed with police reports and case files, many of them unrelated to him entirely. How Elvis had acquired them was unclear, but they showed a fixation with crime, betrayal, and sudden loss, almost as though he was trying to piece together the patterns of human downfall. Even stranger were the notebooks filled with his own writings. They were not lyrics or song ideas, but rambling, paranoid reflections. He wrote about being watched, about phones tapped, about not trusting even the closest people in his circle. On one page, scrawled in frantic handwriting, he wrote, "They want the king, but they don't care if the man dies." It wasn't just paranoia. These words carried the raw pain of someone who believed his fame had turned into a prison he could never escape. Then came another unsettling collection: masks, costumes, and elaborate disguises. Hidden in a corner trunk were wigs, fake mustaches, police uniforms, even elaborate robes. Some were pristine, others worn and frayed, as if used more than once. Had Elvis been preparing to walk outside unnoticed? Or were these disguises part of a private obsession, a fantasy of slipping away from being Elvis Presley, if only for a night? Tucked in with them were maps with routes highlighted, hotels circled, and handwritten notes suggesting plans to leave Graceland without anyone knowing. It raised the question, was Elvis preparing to vanish? To leave behind the fame and the chaos that consumed him? Or was it only wishful thinking from a man who no longer knew how to be himself? The basement revealed a man obsessed with endings, with death, with escape. It revealed a king not basking in glory, but drowning in fear. These weren't the treasures of a superstar. They were the artifacts of a man trying desperately to hold on to control, even as he felt it slipping through his fingers. When whispers of the basement's contents reached the Presley family, reactions were mixed, and the secrets it revealed cut deeper than anyone outside Graceland could have imagined. For decades, the Presley legacy had been carefully curated, a balance of myth and memory that protected Elvis as both a cultural icon and a beloved father. But the letters, tapes, and artifacts dragged private wounds into the light, exposing family struggles that had long been buried beneath the legend. Some of the unsent letters Elvis had written to Priscilla revealed not just love and regret, but also bitterness over their divorce, over the pressures of fame that tore their marriage apart, and over the people he believed had come between them. In one letter, he accused unnamed advisors of manipulating him, of turning him against the woman he once trusted most. Though the letter was never sent, its words hung heavy with unresolved pain, suggesting Elvis felt betrayed not only by his handlers, but by the very institution of his marriage. For Priscilla, seeing those words must have been devastating, reopening old wounds that time had only partly healed. Even more haunting were Elvis's letters and notes to Lisa Marie. They were not written to a child, but to the woman he imagined she would one day become. He wrote about the dangers of fame, about the emptiness behind the curtain, and about the vultures who circled stars until they had nothing left to give. "Don't let them use you like they used me," he warned in one note, a chilling prediction considering Lisa Marie's own struggles with the spotlight years later. He wrote of his fears for her future, of his desire to see her live a life free from the chains of celebrity, even as he admitted he had no idea how to escape those chains himself. The basement also contained financial documents that hinted at growing problems behind the scenes, records of debts, contracts, and disputes that suggested the Presley empire was not as stable as fans believed. Hidden among the memorabilia were notes expressing Elvis's anger at how money was being handled, his frustration at being treated as an endless resource rather than a human being. These revelations struck a painful chord for the family, who had worked tirelessly to protect his image and preserve his legacy. But perhaps the hardest truth the basement revealed was that Elvis had contemplated walking away from it all. The maps, disguises, and rambling notes weren't the fantasies of a man playing dress-up. They were the desperate plans of someone who saw no other escape. For his family, this knowledge must have been unbearable, forcing them to confront the possibility that Elvis had not died simply of poor health or exhaustion, but of a slow, crushing despair that consumed him long before his final night. The secrets found in the basement didn't just change how the world saw Elvis, they changed how his family understood the man they had lost, forcing them to face the shadows of a king who had lived two lives, one for the public and one hidden underground, waiting to be uncovered. The revelations from Elvis Presley's basement did more than shock fans or intrigue historians. They forced the world to confront the fragile, hidden humanity of a man who had been mythologized as larger than life. For decades, the king of rock and roll had been remembered through a carefully polished lens. The swiveling hips, the screaming crowds, the rhinestone jumpsuits, the triumphant returns to the stage. But beneath Graceland, in a space untouched by the museum lights, was a different Elvis, a man who carried fears, regrets, and obsessions that the public never saw. The tapes where he spoke into the darkness weren't just confessions, they were cries for help from a soul trapped between two identities. Elvis Aaron, the boy from Tupelo who longed for peace, and Elvis Presley, the global icon who could never be left alone. The letters to Priscilla and Lisa Marie weren't just private messages. They were raw evidence of a man who loved deeply, but struggled to keep love alive under the crushing weight of fame. The strange disguises and highlighted maps weren't just odd relics. They suggested a king who dreamed of escape, who wanted to disappear and shed the crown that had become too heavy to carry. Even the clippings, the crime reports, the endless notes about death and endings painted a picture of someone who saw his own fate coming long before it arrived. The world had been told that Elvis died of a heart attack, of exhaustion, of poor health worsened by addiction. But the basement suggested another truth, that Elvis was already dying long before his final day, a slow spiritual unraveling that no doctor could have cured. For his fans, these discoveries were devastating yet strangely comforting. Devastating because the king they worshipped was shown to be so vulnerable, so broken, so painfully human. Comforting because they revealed that beneath the glitter and the legend was a man who felt the same fears, heartbreaks, and longings as everyone else. He was not a god, not untouchable, but a man who carried burdens too heavy for one person to bear. The Presley family, for their part, faced an impossible task. How do you preserve a legacy when the truth threatens to fracture it? Do you hide the evidence, locking it away again to protect the myth? Or do you share it, letting the world finally see Elvis not as an untouchable king, but as a man consumed by his crown? Their silence in the years since the discoveries only deepened the mystery, leaving fans to speculate, argue, and imagine what Elvis's final years were truly like. But in the end, perhaps the greatest gift of the basement isn't the shock or the scandal. It's the reminder that legends are human. Elvis Presley gave the world music that still shakes the soul, performances that still electrify, a spirit that still lives on in every note of rock and roll. But in his basement, he left something even more powerful: honesty. Honesty about the price of fame, about the loneliness of glory, about the fragile heart beating beneath the crown. He left behind a story that challenges us to look past the myth and see the man who carried it. And maybe that is the truest legacy of all. Because what they found in Elvis Presley's basement wasn't just memorabilia, wasn't just artifacts, wasn't just letters or tapes. What they found was Elvis himself, his doubts, his dreams, his fears, his regrets, all sealed away in the dark, waiting for the day they would be uncovered. And now that they have been, the world will never see him the same way again. The king of rock and roll, adored by millions, worshipped like a god, was not just larger than life, he was smaller than we ever imagined, fragile in ways the stage lights never revealed. And perhaps that is why his story will never fade. Because in the end, Elvis Presley wasn't just the king. He was human. And sometimes, the truth hidden in the basement is far more powerful than the legend that lived above it.